Considering Bloober Team's reputation and past output, I didn't have high expectations for the Silent Hill 2 remake. But they did surprise me in some ways. There's some quality level design and solid expansions and additions on the puzzle front. Combat, while not great, is serviceable. That said, the remake suffers from excessive padding and bloat. A runtime that's about double that of the original. The tight pacing of Silent Hill 2 is gone, replaced by a meandering, long-winded journey that detracts from the experience. And then there's the narrative. The Silent Hill 2 remake feels like someone copied someone else's homework without understanding the reasons behind the answers. Sure, most of the beats are the same, and most of the dialogue remains, although there are some odd removals and additions. But it's the whole package that falters. The voice acting, pacing, lighting, cinematography, it's all off. The result is a surface-level interpretation that lacks what made the original special. One thing that's always stuck with me about the original Silent Hill 2 is what Takeyoshi Sato, one of the head creatives, said about their goals. Psychological horror needs to shake the human heart deeply. I kept this in mind while playing the remake. The only thing that got plenty of shaking was my head at the creative decisions made, from the bloated runtime to losing the essence of the original's narrative. I'm tired of remakes, but if they're going to keep making them, I hope they can do the original justice. There are glimpses of it here and there, but they're few and far between. In this video, I'll go through where the remake does the original justice and where it goes wrong. As well, we'll go over some of the original's legacy, and its reputation of having a sizable fan base who's never played the game. There's merit to the meme of huge Silent Hill 2 fan excited to play it for the first time. Before we dive in, this is a full spoiler dive for both the remake and the original. And a quick note on performance. I had to brighten some of the footage in post due to YouTube's handling of dark scenes. As well, as you could see, I didn't have the best experience performance-wise with my system. By no means do I have a powerful computer. I'm running an RTX 3060. Part of my runtime was devoted to constant fiddling of graphics settings and config files. Name a better duo than Unreal Engine and constant stuttering. Here's to hoping they patch the game for better performance. Special shout out to my fellow Boulder punchers for supporting the channel through Patreon and YouTube memberships. If you want early access to videos, consider joining the family, son. And now, in the words of Eddie from the original Silent Hill 2, because they cut the line in the remake for some reason,
let's party!
One thing that stood out to me right away was the descent into Silent Hill. In the original, the heavy fog enveloped James as he made his way down the path, evoking the feeling that there's no turning back. In the remake, it feels like a jaunt into the woods on a foggy day. If you want to turn back, no big deal. There are moments in the remake where the fog becomes more dense to evoke tension. If there was a time to increase the density of the fog, the descent into town was one of them. Upon entering the town proper, the game shows its hand with its additions. Instead of finding the key to Woodside Apartments in an alleyway, we're off on a fetch quest. We have to collect various items from several locations. Remember those stores you saw in the original that you couldn't enter, like Texan Cafe or Happy Burger? Well, now you can. Some optional, some along the critical path. This is the name of the game for the Silent Hill 2 remake. Take the tight pacing of the original and kiss it goodbye, because it's padding city, baby. One of the biggest red flags before release was hearing about how the remake was going to be about double the length of the original. Well, estimates given by developers tend to be an overestimation. So I thought, or they added in a bunch of side content. That's where the longer runtime could come from. And that was true to an extent. Most of that addition is along the critical path. And boy did they bloat the game's runtime. They were on the mark when they said the game was about double the length of the original. Now, game length is a contentious subject. If you're paying $60 for a game, you want to get a fair chunk of time out of it. I've seen and know others who decide on game purchases based on how much time they'll get out of the game. Something I've never been in the mindset of. The game gives me a great experience. Runtime doesn't tend to be a huge issue, but there's a sizable portion of customers who put great weight into the game's runtime in making a purchasing decision. I can understand that for something like an RPG or an open world title, but it doesn't work the same for horror games. Of all genres out there, survival horror is one of the last places you want a bloated runtime. Instead, you want a concise, tight experience that offers plenty of replayability. In the original Silent Hill 2, you had 6 possible endings. Some you could only unlock in New Game Plus. In the remake, there are now 8 endings. So there's no lack of incentive for players to run through the game again. But with this bloated runtime, no thanks, bro. It's the most egregious case of horror title padding its runtime since Alien Isolation. Now, I loved Alien Isolation, one of the best horror titles of the last decade, but by far its largest issue was how it overstayed its welcome. Cutting a good 15 to 20% from its runtime would have done wonders. For the Silent Hill 2 remake, to double its runtime was a fool's errand. If they shot for something in the 15 to 25% range, that would have worked. But beyond the surface level take of the original story, the game's bloat is by far the largest issue. By the time I reached the Blue Creek apartments, I was ready for the apartment section to be over. But no, it's time to find all the hands for the clock to progress further. The bloating continues after Maria joins us. Instead of taking a detour to the bowling alley in Heaven's Night before the hospital, we go on a longer excursion. We stop by the motel, in a short stretch that I didn't mind as an addition. But then we have a meandering stretch after Heaven's Night to a nearby park that should have remained on the cutting room floor. We'll find Eddie and Laura at a nearby movie theater instead of the bowling alley, before finally making our way to the hospital in pursuit of Laura. There's also a stretch within this bit where the fog grows dense and a large number of monsters descend on us, something that clashes with the game's tone and sticks out like a sore thumb. One of those modern additions that I guess we need to have, else the player will lose interest. The remake doesn't have many moments like this, but they really stick out. I really did enjoy the hospital at first. Having the first stretch during a sunset was a nice touch. A calm before the storm. Once Maria takes a breather, it's now a rainy night. But once again, they overplay their hand with bloating the area out. By the time I got to the Otherworld section, I was ready to move on from the hospital. On the note of the Otherworld sections, why did they make them more in line with the other worlds of Silent Hill 1 and 3? In the original Silent Hill 2, they were more subdued. They're still here to an extent, but there's far more rust and blood, gratings, and spinning fans. It's as if they made assets they could reuse down the line for a certain title that uses some of the same locales as Silent Hill 2. I found it a bit ironic that I didn't mind the stretch between the hospital and the Historical Society. The reason for this irony is it's one of the areas in the original game that I felt went on a bit too long. It gave us time to digest what happened at the hospital before moving on to the prison. I felt it could have had tighter pacing. That said, I have to wonder if I feel this way due to the excessive padding elsewhere. I found the prison to have much better pacing than the apartments in the hospital. It didn't overstay its welcome. I like the addition of giving yourself more light for a brief period of time. I wish I could say the same about the pacing of the labyrinth. It keeps going on and on and on. By the time I was able to enter Maria's cell, it was more of a sense of relief. Thank God that stretch is over. As opposed to the fact that Maria lies dead before James. At least the game's pacing is at its best in the end stretch. I didn't find the hotel to suffer any major bloating. You know, if they were so concerned about the game's runtime, you know what they could have done? They could have included Born from a Wish. But of course, Born from a Wish makes for a DLC they can sell down the road. I don't want to know how much padding they're going to add to that. And you know what makes all this bloat and padding a bummer? I thought they did a good job with the level design. Something I didn't give much thought to before playing the game, but it took me by surprise. I found it to be the game's biggest success. They did a great job of taking the foundation of the original and making it into its own thing. Changes made to suit the over-the-shoulder perspective, with rooms no longer siloed off. One key element being the greater emphasis on interconnected level design. Not that there wasn't any in the original Silent Hill 2, but here they dialed it up. They offer a large amount of shortcuts to loop around areas. Opening up a shortcut is one of the many joys of a survival horror game. The relief of looping around to a prior area, or the realization of where you are. Something that never gets old. Well, sort of. If anything, the Silent Hill 2 remake goes overboard with how many shortcuts you can unlock. For the apartments, the prison, the hotel, they felt like they had the right amount. It's the hospital where they go overboard with all the shortcuts you can unlock, to the point of hilarity. Like, do we need one in this washroom when the hallway is right there? That said, the level design is one of the best elements of the Silent Hill 2 remake. It's too bad the game pads out so much of its runtime. And some of that padding is due to how the game handles navigation and how it guides the player. Leading up to release, one of the producers mentioned that they wouldn't use yellow paint or immersion-breaking forms of player guidance. Well, they didn't use yellow paint. But there were many cases of immersion-breaking moments. White cloth is the primary means of guiding the player. They give indication of ledges to jump over, walls to break, holes to crawl through. While less egregious and hokey than yellow paint, it still overplays its hand. To know, it's one of those modern gaming issues that have to contend with graphic fidelity. With so much emphasis on fidelity as opposed to art direction, you need to be a bit more heavy-handed while guiding the player. God forbid we give more emphasis on art direction these days. If you want to talk about immersion breaking, nothing broke my immersion more than dragging these bins around. Placed them in position to climb through a window. The town of Silent Hill can do many things, but having the handles fall off the bins when put in the right place is a bit much, and the game used it over and over to comical effect. The one that most took me out of the moment was right after room 312 at the hotel. James comes to terms with what he did. The hotel is now dilapidated, water everywhere. One of my favorite music tracks kicks in. There's such a bleak atmosphere in the air. Oh, now let's move this bin around to move forward. Talk about a buzzkill. The thing that makes the guidance and navigation disappointing is that the game does a decent job of it in other ways. Like the wind chimes in front of the record store grabbing your attention. Sections like the hospital apartments do a good job with lighting to guide the player. They use lighting to put emphasis on certain areas or doors. So I have to ask, Did we need to have so many walls to break down, holes to climb through, windows to smash and jump through? Did we need to have all these bins to push into place to progress? Do we need to have all these narrow passages for James to squeeze his way through? In some cases, developers use these navigation tricks to mask loading screens, but it's not the only thing they use them for. From what I understand, it's far less than what players think for masking loading. Squeezing through narrow passageways keeps the player moving forward and not giving them a chance to go back. There are a few cases where the remake does this, but that's the exception and not the norm. Did they think the player would become bored if we weren't given enough bins to push around or holes to climb through? Unless there were technical reasons for these to be here, they could have cut most, if not all of them, for a far better experience. In that case, there had been far little need for all the white cloth. I do appreciate that they didn't make James a blabbermouth to help guide the player. Those little grunts while trying to open a locked door were more than enough. James marking down things on his map was a nice touch. I like to have pen and paper on hand for these kind of games, but it was nice for James to make note of combinations or clues on the map as we came across them. There's only one real moment that stood out to me of wishing James stayed quiet during gameplay. That was picking up the map at the hotel. Room 312 has "Waiting for You" marked on the map, in which James says, "Our room." I have to note this is less a case of praise and more a case of the game not adhering to some of the brain-dead, intrusive ways modern games guide the player. There are different considerations for guiding the player with an over-the-shoulder perspective compared to fixed cameras of old. While the remake does falter, there are areas where they did a good job of guiding the player. Speaking of fixed cameras, the game will bring up moments from the original in a not-so-subtle way. We'll come across glimpses of the past in certain rooms or coming across items, like the room of the coin puzzle from the original, which now has different placement. Some will even change to a fixed camera perspective, like where we first fought Pyramid Head in the apartments. It's very much a case of the game giving your shoulder a nudge saying, "Hey, remember that from the original? Remember that?" These became eye-rolling over time and only wish I was playing the original Silent Hill 2 instead. I didn't mind having them around, but let the player discover them. Make it more subtle. There's no need to make a whole song and dance about finding them. To note, you could also view this as less as a shoulder nudge, more that James has been looping through this journey several times. For combat in Silent Hill 2 Remake, the word serviceable comes to mind. Of all the issues I have with the game, combat is lower on the list. It's what you expect from any over-the-shoulder title over the last 15 years. The previews of combat before release did not look promising, but it handles better than I thought. Is it great? By no means, but does keep some of that clunky nature of combat from the original. On the note of combat in the original Silent Hill 2, that's always been a contentious issue. That's clunky, that's awful, that sucks. Again, I'll bring up the word serviceable. That's how I feel about combat from the Team Silent era titles. For what the games were going for, combat was serviceable. Silent Hill was more about the atmosphere, the puzzles, and the narrative. It was never as focused on combat and resource management compared to its counterpart, Resident Evil. The first 3 Resident Evil titles, especially the RE1 remake, are the best showing of fixed camera survival horror combat and resource management. Aggressive enemies and narrow hallways. Invading them was an involved process. You had limited resources and a limited inventory to contend with. The Team Silent titles were generous with resources. Ammo was never in short supply if you were thorough in your exploration. You didn't have to contend with limited inventories. At least until Silent Hill 4, and they dropped the ball hard on their implementation. Enemies were easy enough to run by due to lower aggression, wider hallways, or open areas. In the remake, they made resources more stingy, and running past enemies more difficult. You can still shut off the flashlight and radio and walk to get by, but enemies are far more aggressive. As well, it's not like we could leave to another room and have them reset their placement. If their goal was to make the mannequins the most annoying enemies since those little buggers in 3 that knocked over Heather, mission accomplished. They dialed back the radio range, so we have far less warning of an enemy's presence. And these little buggers love to hide around corners or blend into the environment. I can't count how many times over the course of the game I'd fall for one of their ambushes. And it only got worse when they began to climb during the prison section. There's a room in the hotel full of actual mannequins, where I was super on guard of ambushes. And they still got me, so kudos to the team and how much mileage they were able to get out of the mannequins. On the note of monster designs, bringing back Masahiro Ito was a good choice. Goes a long way of building goodwill. Plus it gives him something else to do than argue with literal who's on Twitter. Dodging works fine for what they're going for. There's good visual and audio tells of when you want to dodge. Again, for what they're going for, it's serviceable. I was expecting a lot worse than we got. Although some of the hit detection can be a bit spotty. There are a few cases of taking damage from lying figures that I felt I shouldn't have. They should have spent more time working on hit detection than working with hit detection. It's again too bad the game bloats out its runtime with an excessive enemy count. Beyond that stretch where a bunch of enemies descend on James and Maria while making their way to Heaven's Night, there are some eye-rolling sections that never should have made it into the game. There's one bit in the prison where we have to navigate through the showers to find a key item. The room is large, and the item is at the back of the room. If you played any horror game, you know warning bells are going off in your head. As soon as you pick up this item, monsters are going to descend upon you. And that's exactly what happens. Felt so out of place here. It works fine in other horror games, although a major cliche by this point. But the original never really did anything like this, and it clashes with the remake's tone. But by far the worst moment is in the labyrinth. There's a couple of rooms which lock you in until you clear out the waves of enemies. In a game like Dead Space, Resident Evil 4, something more action heavy, fine. But this is the polar opposite of what Silent Hill 2 is going for. I mean, I guess it could have been worse. They could have included more of these. That said, they never should have made it past the planning stages. Again, Silent Hill's combat has always been serviceable, with more focus on the atmosphere, the narrative, and the puzzles. On the note of puzzles, it's one of the better successes of the Silent Hill 2 remake. I had a lot of curiosity going in, seeing what they would add, change, or expand upon. I did have puzzles set on hard to get the most of them. I love how they expanded on the coin puzzle in the apartments. Instead of one riddle, we worked through 4 of them. We can now flip each coin, so there's more combinations to consider. Having the riddle visible at all times was a nice touch, as opposed to having to flip back and forth in the original. Same goes for the noose puzzle. Having everything in one location works better than having to move back and forth between rooms. And thank God they made the rotating cube far less annoying. God, I hated that puzzle in the original. Now you can see what the rotations do without having to walk away from the cube. Some puzzles got me writing on paper, doing math, and keeping bed mass in mind. While not on the hard difficulty, I have to know it's pretty funny they made 0451 as one of the safe combinations on easier puzzle difficulties. The additions of what I like to call palette cleanser puzzles work well, like sorting books in the right order, weighing scales, or putting a glass in the right location on a broken mirror. Short and sweet, and a nice feeling upon solving. They avoided what I like to call the regurgitator puzzle, where you make note of something in one room and put that down elsewhere as a one-to-one copy. Something oh so common as a puzzle in survival horror games. While they have similar puzzles here like that, you still have to work through some hurdles to get the right answer. Of the puzzles, there were only a couple that I didn't really gel with, like the one in the apartments of finding the combinations written on the walls. The other one being the returning music box puzzle in the hotel, something bare bones in the original. I didn't care much for what they did with it here, especially the turning of keys. Solving it felt less of a case of, aha, and more of, well, I'm glad that's over. On the subject of music, Akira Yamaoka returns to spruce up the soundtrack. Like Yudo, bringing him in adds a lot of goodwill to the game. The original soundtrack was knockout after knockout in its delivery. Some tracks remain the same, other with new layers and instrumentation on top. I mean, it's been over 20 years. If you're creative revisiting old works, you may want to make tweaks. Take what you've learned over the years and add a coat of paint on top. But there are some questionable changes, like the scene of first meeting Marie in the park. The original track did a great job of evoking intrigue and mystery for such a pivotal moment in the story.
You could be her twin. Your face, your voice, just your hair and clothes are different.
My name is Maria. I don't look like a ghost, do I?
Here, the track takes a funkier tone, more sleazy. For lack of a better term, it makes use of porno instrumentation, like something you'd hear from a 1970s adult film. Not that I know, but that's the best way to describe it. Something I found distracting in the scene in the case of a track being overdone.
I can show you if you want. Unless you have somewhere else to be. Something else to do. Hey, easy there. I'm just messing with you. Come on. It's this way.
There's a similar approach to the instrumentation additions to the song in Heaven's Night, but it works much better there. The more sleazy environment makes these additions more suitable.
Can't we stay? Just for a little while. Catch our breath before we head back out there.
I don't have time to take a break. Mary could be out there, waiting for me.
Then you have scenes with different music altogether, like the scene of finding Maria dead in the cell in the labyrinth. In the original, you're hit with this haunting, dissonant track that makes the scene another gut punch. The track continues until James jumps into the hole in his grave.
Maria? Maria? Maria, no! What happened to you? Why?
The remake does contain the track, but only plays after the scene of James mourning Maria's death. Instead, we get a straightforward, sad piano track that has nowhere near the same impact. or the scene at Mary's bedside in the Leave ending, which for whatever reason they cut from the In Water ending. The original had this minimal, beautiful track, one that's a perfect complement to the scene, of confessions, forgiveness, and the last goodbye between James and Mary. In a game full of amazing scenes, this one floors me every single time.
That's why I did it, honey. I just couldn't watch you suffer. No. That's not true. You also said you didn't want to die. The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
James, if that were true, then why do you look so sad?
The scene in the remake gets the same treatment as Maria's death in her cell with a music change. We get a sad piano track that's fine, but has nowhere near the same impact as the original track.
The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
If that's true, then why do you look so sad?
And on the topic of lacking the impact of the original, let's now get to the story. The mention of the game's doubled runtime was a huge red flag before release, but to me the largest red flag was the story. What they showed in trailers up to release did not impress me. It looked like a surface level understanding of what made the story work in the original, like they copied the homework without understanding the whys behind the words. Having played through the remake, it is a mixed bag. Some character arcs are able to land more than others. Some scenes do a reasonable job of evoking the spirit from the original. There are a few decent additions. But when it comes to the key scenes and character beats that have made the original so beloved, discussed, and dissected for over 20 years, they fall flat. It's the entire package. It's not only the words they say, words they added, or words removed, it's how they're said, the pauses, the body language, the lighting, the cinematography. The original had such a strong grasp on all these elements, whereas the remake does not. So let's go through the characters and the major beats of the story, and look at what went right and what missed the mark. Before we dive in, I want to bring up the voice acting of the original Silent Hill 2. It's a contentious issue like the combat. Some find the voice acting in the original hokey, amateur, awkward, stilted. I do understand why some people feel that way.
Excuse me,
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
But was a deliberate choice on the team's part. It's to evoke that dreamlike, detached, otherworldly feel that you'd find in the works of David Lynch. That's dialed back in the remake to something more straightforward. While I don't find the performances up to par of the original, I don't think the performances here were bad. It's a tricky thing to get right, but I think the actors did a good job given with what they were working with. It's the direction, the lighting, the pacing, the cinematography. The entire package is lacking. Of all the characters in the remake, I found they did James the most justice. There's still that sense of desperation in his actions and in his words, but it's more quiet, more subdued. He's still very much an everyman. There's an ad scene between James and Maria at Heaven's Night, which felt like a logical addition, as I always found it odd that there wasn't any scene between the two in the original. In this added scene, Maria offers James a drink. The original made reference to his struggles with alcohol in the flavor text. Here we gotta see that play out. The camera focuses on the drink in his hands. You can see he's considering it before he suggests they leave. He's been down that road before, and he knows where it leads. It's a great little addition that says so much about James' character in all but 10 seconds.
Here's to hope. I'm dying.
We should probably get going.
Fine.
As far as Laura goes, they did a reasonable job with her. She has a different kind of bratty attitude than the original. Notice the difference in how she laughs at James when she kicks the key away in the woodside apartment.
Ow!
Ha ha.
Hey, wait! Damn it.
Hey! Wait!
She comes across as older here compared to the original despite being the same age. I did like the addition of James asking about her parents when he runs into her after the apartments. Her reaction says all we need to know about that subject.
That's not very nice. Didn't your parents teach you any manners?
The scene with her and James in the hotel is one of the better scenes in capturing the spirit of the original. Interesting that they had Mary voice the letter to Laura, whereas in the original we read it ourselves. They did record a voiceover for Mary reading it, but cut it from the original. I have to note the hilarity of how much of a red flag they make of the room in the hospital where Laura says she left Mary's letter. The room where she locks us in where we fight flesh lips. In the original it didn't seem like a big deal at first, not until James enters. Here they make a big deal about it before we even enter. They might as well have written boss fight on the door.
In there.
As mentioned, I found combat serviceable for both the original and the remake. How about the boss battles? There wasn't much to them in the original. Doing a quality boss battle with fixed cameras can be tricky. Silent Hill is always more focused on the atmosphere, the story, and the puzzles as opposed to its combat. In another case of game bloat, the remake pads out the bosses. While we only fight one flesh flip, it has another phase to it. Multi-phase boss fights is the name of the game in the remake. If there's one thing that the game's combat should be avoiding, it's reminding me about the existence of Homecoming. This won't be the only fight that does so. Eddie's where things become more mixed. Look at the differences in his intro. In the original, the washroom is a lot smaller. Eddie's right there. He spends most of his time over the toilet and not looking at James. While he might be a friendly face, there's still something off about him. He has his own demons as well that brought him here. It's a very claustrophobic feel in the air. In the remake, he comes across as more sympathetic. There's a larger space between him and James in the larger washroom. He's facing James for most of the conversation. He comes across as someone more to pity and not to be afraid of. Whereas in the original, there is that feeling in the air of something being wrong with him. And then we have the pizza scene. Well, sort of. While the pizza box is there, he's digging into ice cream. Nice touch of seeing his breath as he digs into the ice cream, seeing how his final encounter is, in his other world. So the infamous pizza line is still in the remake, but you have to seek it out.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
The ice cream scene takes place in a movie theater instead of the bowling alley. You could stop by the Boulderama before heading to the Historical Society. You can find the pizza at the bowling alley in one of those glimpses to the past. James gives a more nonchalant response to its being there.
This town's full of monsters. Who could just sit here and eat pizza?
It felt like the game was trying to be too cute with this. Why not leave it as is and have it occur during the scene with James and Eddie? Outside of a couple of the endings and a few other moments, it's a nice dose of humor in a game with little. Bringing up another remake. The actor who played Leon in the Resident Evil 4 remake mentioned in an interview that the infamous bingo line wasn't in the original script. There was something else in place. While filming the scene, they decided to give the bingo line a shot for the sake of it. And that's what they ended up keeping. I have to wonder if they did give it a try here and found it didn't work out, or it didn't fit. Still, I was very curious to see how this exchange would play out in the remake and what we get as a disappointment. The lead up to the fight with Eddie is a great example of the remake losing the plot with its cinematography. The constant shifting of the camera in the original is gone. There it's clear that Eddie is imitating those who made fun of him. Here he gets all up in James's face about it and it took me a second to realize what he was doing.
You fat, disgusting piece of shit, you make me sick. You gonna cry, fat ass? You gonna run to your mama? Waste of skin, why don't you just kill yourself?
Removing the first part of the fight from the original was a wise move. Along with James dodging the bullet, Eddie fires his way. Instead, the fight only occurs in the room over. And that's pretty brave of James to take a swing at Eddie while looking down the barrel of a gun. But it's a bummer they cut the "have you gone nuts" line. It's very much an uh-oh moment in the original. James, what have you done?
Eddie, have you gone nuts?
I knew it. You too. You're just like him, James.
The fight here works fine for what they're going for, keeping the spirit of the original but giving it a more claustrophobic feel, but falls victim to the game's padding of adding phases to the boss fight, something that again goes on longer than it needs to. Interesting to note that they cut the real human being line. Instead, James is silent after the fight. To be honest, whenever I hear a real human being, the meme pops to mind. What about Pyramid Head? In the original, when you first come across him in the one apartment, it was a shocking moment. The game throws it right in your face upon entering. Here there's a build to it. And while in some cases that can be good, it loses much of that violent nature of the original scene. There's a few more thoughts I have about Pyramid Head, but hold that thought until we get to Maria. Then we have Angela. This is where the reimagining of characters begins to really go off the rails. When they announced that Bloober Team would be developing the Silent Hill 2 remake, there was a lot of concern with how they would handle the story, especially Angela's story. Her history of abuse and suffering is heartbreaking. Dealing with dark themes is a very tricky ordeal. There's a very delicate line when dealing with such subject matter. There's a good reason you don't see this kind of subject matter handled in many games. If not handled right, it comes across as tasteless and hacky. If you want a perfect example of that, look to The Medium, one of Bloober's prior works. It tackles themes of childhood abuse with a grace and subtlety as a sledgehammer to the face. So how did they do with Angela's story? After all, they had a template to work with. While better than I was expecting, it still loses much of the nuance and subtleties of the original. It comes nowhere close to delivering justice to her tragic story. Angela's appearance and voice in the original is one of those contentious issues. She's supposed to be around 19 but looks far older. Her voice is off-putting. Again, this was all a deliberate choice. She looks older due to the effects of stress and abuse. They went with a voice actor who is older. So when she talks about her mama, it comes across as off-putting, uneasy, that something's not right. Her shifting tones throughout emphasize these points.
Me too. I'm looking for my mama. I mean my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her.
Most of those elements don't transfer over to the remake. I'm talking beyond how distracting it is with how much she looks like the actor David Duchovny. The performance given here is one note and flat.
I'm looking for my mama. I mean my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her.
I'm not sure how much is on the actress. Part of the equation, but not all. The writing and choice of direction plays a large role. There's little of these shift moments in her. When she tries to give the knife to James in the remake, it loses the impact of the original.
No! I'm sorry! I've been bad! Please don't!
We do get an additional scene with Angela after the hospital and before the prison. It's fine for what it is. Nothing spectacular, but nothing that stuck out like a sore thumb. It does a reasonable job of capturing that uneasy feeling in the air, a sense of detachment. But then we get to the abstract daddy fight. Now in the original, it's not like it was subtle of what the room was implying. It was a concise stretch that said all that it needed to. It left the rest for the player to fill in the blanks. In the remake, it becomes a drawn-out affair with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. The abstract daddy will chase us through memories of Angela's home. He'll barrel through walls like he's Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7. There are some small spaces to hide. Places where Angela hid growing up. You can hear bits and pieces of her father's words during this fight. I can see what they were going for. They want to integrate more of her backstory into the fight, but it comes across, for lack of a better term, video gamey. There are various degrees in how they change the bosses in the remake. For example, the fight with the two pyramid heads near the end remains more in line with the original. If there is a boss I felt that needed the least amount of change, it was the abstract daddy fight. There wasn't much to it as a fight, but there was a great importance of it on the narrative front. While not exactly subtle, it said all it needed to say about Angela and her tragic past. It left plenty of room for the player to fill in the blanks. That is all lost in the remake. That said, I did appreciate that they didn't make the abstract daddy an enemy to fight in the hotel, something I never agreed with in the original. It took away from the boss fight. Having a boss fight become a normal enemy is one of those great gaming tropes, in the right game, not in Silent Hill 2, so props to them for not including it in the hotel. A testament to how much mileage they were able to get out of enemies like the mannequins. And then we have her farewell scene. In the original, in a game full of incredible scenes, this is near the very top. It's one of the best examples with how much is lost in the remake with how it's shot. In the original, we get a stretched shot from the first person. Angela's looking down on James, mocking him.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
Here they're more or less on equal footing, and in some cases looking down on Angela. The more one-note approach in her performance loses most of the weight to her mocking James, and the scene itself.
Or maybe you think you can save me? Will you love me? Care for me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
Another element that's lost is how we don't get to walk around the room after. In the original, we could try to climb the stairs, only for the fire to stop us. In the remake, James leaves the room during a cutscene. It's a small little moment, but giving the player the chance to at least try to climb the stairs and leave when they want would have done so much. Let's take the room in, take in what just happened, before prompting an action for leaving and cut to a cutscene. The best thing I could say for the handling of Angela's story is it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. Considering Bloober's history in dealing with similar themes in games like The Medium, I was expecting worse. That said, it loses so much of the nuance and the tragedies of Angela. It doesn't do her story justice. And at long last, we have the enigma that is Maria. She's one of the key reasons the story of the original works as well as it does. She is a tricky character to get right, and how Team Silent were able to do so is a testament to their strength as storytellers. Maria's actress in the original, Monica Taylor Horgan, turned in the best performance of that game, one of my favorite performances of a game character. How the remake handled Maria is where they really drop a ball. A lot of the time it comes across like they weren't sure how to write her character for the remake, starting with her appearance. Beyond the odd proportions of her head, there's the issue with the outfit. The iconic outfit of the original is gone. Well, sort of. There's a scene where she comes across it at the motel, a nudge to the player of, hey, remember this?
Hey, you think I'd look good in this one?
Sure.
Not quite the ringing endorsement, but hey, I'll take it.
I had the thought that at some point, she may take off her jacket to tempt James, give him more of a peek of what lies beneath. The additional scene at Heaven's Night seemed like the perfect place to do so, but that never happens. Her original outfit was a key element of who Maria was, part of that playful, seductive nature of hers, a temptress to James. And while not the full equation, it's still part of the equation. God forbid we let a woman show her belly button these days. I guess we have to take into consideration modern sensibilities. And sure, we don't offend those who will complain about it, yet aren't the target audience and will never play this game. The first meeting with Maria is another one of those showings of the remake losing the spirit of the original. The remake tends to stick to shot, reverse shot. In the original, there was a lot more energy and momentum with the shifting camera shots. In the remake, Maria touches James with her hand. In the original, she took James's hand and placed it on her chest, a change that takes away from the playful, seductive nature of Maria, along with the removal of her implying that James hated Mary. Nothing about the hotel is brought up. Instead, we begin the meandering stretch of wandering around to various locales before heading our way to the hospital. Her death scene in the hospital is one of those great examples where you can lose so much when you're not using fixed cameras. Pyramid Head chasing you through the halls in the original had this claustrophobic feeling, narrow hallways and shifting cameras giving a disoriented feel to the chase. Here we get a by-the-book, ho-hum chase scene. Hop over a few things along the way. There's a real lack of tension. Then you have the odd cut of James ending up ahead of Maria, despite Maria being in front a moment before. There's a lack of frantic energy as James fights to keep the elevator door open for Maria before Pyramid Head kills her. The end result, like so many scenes, is the remake losing the impact and the constant gun punches that the original delivered. Then we have the I'm not your Mary scene in the labyrinth. Oh boy. When they first showed this in one of the trailers leading up to release, I was like, good lord, did they butcher this scene. Now, to be fair, the final product is better than what was shown. That whooshing ambience in the background helps, and with the full context, it's better. But it's nowhere even close to what the original was able to capture. The original scene is a masterclass, especially once it switches to an FMV. It's my favorite scene in the game, the series, one of my favorite scenes in any game. The dreamlike feeling is at zenith. There's an incredible level of tension and confusion in the air. Is James talking to Mary or Maria? Where does Mary end and Maria begin? The way it's shot, is it Maria behind bars or James? The lighting, the shadow over Maria's eyes add even more to the foreboding atmosphere. That minimal, ambient whooshing in the background is a perfect complement to the scene. Pacing, dialogue, vocal performances. It's one of those scenes I could watch over and over and pick up something new each time. It's one of the best examples, to bring up Takayoshi Sato once again, of the game deeply shaking the human heart.
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
In the remake, there's next to none of that magic. Sure, most of the words are more or less the same, but how they're said, the pacing, the lighting, it's all off. There was a clear distinction between Maria and Mary in the original with Maria's change in tone. There's next to none of that confusion if James is talking to Maria or Mary.
You forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
So you are Maria.
I am. If you want me to be.
All I want from you is an answer.
They cut out the eye roll that Maria does before placing her hand on the face of James. One of those little moments that said so much about Maria and her character. The way Maria's face falls out of focus when she placed her hand on James loses the impact of the moment. It's one of the best examples of Bloober copying Team Silent's homework, but not understanding the why behind the answers. Like all the voice acting, Maria's voice acting is more subdued in the remake. Part of the equation of a loss in that playful, seductive nature of hers from the original. Now, I don't think it's a case of RE4 remake Ada Wong situation where it's clear they made the wrong casting choice. It's more due to the writing and the direction. Again, it felt like they weren't quite sure how to approach her as a character. She comes across as more emotionless, less playful, and loses that lurking feeling of unease along with it. Her "I'm not your Mary" delivery fails to capture any of the vitriol or unease from the original. The same goes for the "anyway" line when we reunite with her in the hospital.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? You don't sound very happy to see me. Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? I was almost killed back there. I have never been so scared in my whole life.
She does do a better job with Mary. While not reaching the heights of the original, I felt the hallway scene with her berating James kept the spirit of the original intact. But there are a couple of scenes in the Unstitched that lose some of their impact due to the inclusion of music. One being the videotape of James coming to the realization of what he's done. The remake went with the choice of adding in music while Mary's talking to James. I prefer the minimal elements of the original, where you can only just hear the dialogue and the video crackling. There's also an odd bit of how room 312 in the hotel changes to that derelict, watered-down look through a fade-in. It loses the impact that the original had from stepping outside the room and seeing the hotel for what it really was. They kept the room the same, but had a cutscene play out as we exited the room, that would have been a better choice. It would have had a far greater impact with its shift. I felt they did a reasonable job with the two pyramid fights at the end. They didn't do anything fancy for multiple phases. Instead, they made it all about timing your dodges against two of them. Although them cutting the lines about James admitting to his weaknesses and why he created them was a bit puzzling. Then again, you could say that about most of the changes or removals throughout. A puzzling addition was James becoming all Canadian and apologizing to Maria before fighting her in the Leave ending. It undercuts how he's moving on and coming to terms with what he's done and who Maria is. Like there's a sense of remorse instead of realization of what he needs to do.
What else can I be?
I am so sorry, Maria. I really am. But this has to stop. It's time to let it go.
The final fight's okay, but again suffers from making the fight multiple phases. They kept the first and final phase, that would have been fine. The addition of the middle phase where James falls through the floor is another case of the game padding out what didn't need padding. These bosses can feel like forever to go down at times. I had to double check that I had my combat difficulty set to standard. Once again, the last thing these fights should be doing is reminding me of Silent Hill Homecoming, which this fight did as we move past the first phase. And then, we have the letter. In the original, it's one of my favorite voice acting performances in anything I've heard. It floors me every single time. The pacing, the words, it's astounding and an absolute gut punch. The lack of music, the scrolling text of the letter, it's perfect. While the actress gives a good attempt in the remake, it's nowhere even close to the original. But there's other questionable factors, like the addition of music. It takes away from the focus of the letter. No longer is there scrolling text of the letter, which had a bit of a hypnotic effect to the letter reading. For the Leave ending in the original, there is a static shot of the graveyard. The remake, it cuts to various locales, and a bit of a distraction, something that's not an issue for the In Water ending. And to cut the "I can't tell you to remember me, but I can't bear for you to forget me" line is mind-boggling. That's the line that always gets me. What a powerful, devastating line. Closing off with James, "You made me happy," it's one of the most powerful, moving moments in any game I've played. But in the remake, there was a feeling of indifference on my part, a shoulder shrug. A shoulder shrug and indifference is how I felt about the remake's attempt at the story. It does have some moments that capture the spirit of the original. There are a few nice additions or changes, but a vast majority of it felt like Bloober copied the homework of Team Silent without understanding the why behind it. What made the original so special, so beloved? The elements that have led many to peel apart, discuss, and dissect for over 20 years? There's little to none of that here. Combine that with a bloated runtime, and you have a remake that fails to do the original justice. Being able to do the original justice was a monumental challenge, no matter who was at the helm. And while it was great they brought in people like Masahiro Ito and Akira Yamaoka in, They should have brought in more from the original team to get the foundations right. My obvious choice would be Mr. Human Heart Shaker himself, Takayoshi Sato. He was the CGI director and had a lot of say on the game's story. That said, he's been working at Nintendo for well over a decade. What about the original's director? Masashi Tsuboyama, or Hiroyuki Waku, the scenario writer, or Akihiro Imamura. He was the director in the game's earlier stages before stepping into a producer role. I couldn't find much information on whether they're still at Konami or elsewhere. I don't know how much of an attempt there was in getting them involved in the project, if at all. But it would have been a far better choice than bringing in consultants known for making video essays. While the bloated runtime is one of the key failures of the remake, failing to capture the story essence of the original is its greatest failure. There are moments, but they are few and far between. The deep shaking of the human heart of the original is nowhere to be found. On note of shaking the human heart, I want to change gears for a bit and talk about the original Silent Hill 2 and its reputation. The original Silent Hill 2 has a reputation as a game people are fan of but haven't played. You might have seen this meme of huge Silent Hill 2 fan excited to play for the first time. To note, this is an edit. The original comes from a harddrive.net article entitled Huge Earthbound fan excited to play it for the first time. And there is truth to this. For the Silent Hill 2 remake, this may be the first time that they're playing Silent Hill 2, but are aware of the original. From playthroughs, streams, or videos on Silent Hill 2. I ended up doing a couple of polls on my channel on people's familiarity with the original Silent Hill 2. One before the remake released, and one after. For the poll before release, there were about 4,600 votes. 21% had beaten the original once. 26% had completed it multiple times. 41% had never played the original, but watched playthroughs or video essays of it. 11% had never played it and were not familiar with it. I did a poll after release for those who had played the remake. I also had the choice of, I played the original Silent Hill 2, but never finished it. I got about 3,800 votes. 21% completed the original once. 31% had completed the original multiple times. 33% had never played the original, but watched playthroughs or essays on it. 7% have never played the original and were not familiar with it. 10% have played the original Silent Hill 2, but never finished it. So while these numbers aren't perfect, I'd love to have more respondents. It does show truth to Silent Hill 2 being a game people are a fan of, but haven't played. I did a follow-up post asking those who hadn't played the original, but were familiar with it through playthroughs or videos on Silent Hill 2. What were some of the reasons they never played the game themselves? There were a multitude of reasons, but 3 were most common. Number 1, too scared to play. Number 2, the lack of accessibility. 3, the tank controls and fixed camera. The game doesn't look fun to play, but I did enjoy watching. So let's start with the first point, being too scared to play. There is a reason that watching Let's Plays or streamers playing horror games is so popular. People love that shared experience. For some way, that's the only way they could deal with the horror. There's not much I can really say on this front. That's your own choice. I could say gather thy courage, take frequent breaks if need be, but that comes down to you. But by far the most interesting point was the lack of accessibility to Silent Hill 2. Some of this does tie back to the first point of being too scared to play. Some mentioned that they were too young, or not even born when the original Silent Hill 2 came out. By the time they felt ready for it, a lack of accessibility got in the way. Konami hasn't made it easy. You had the PlayStation 2 and Xbox release from 2001 and a PC release in 2002. In 2012, you had the Silent Hill HD Collection, which was a bundled remaster of Silent Hill 2 and 3, a remaster working with incomplete source code given to a studio that wasn't up to task. The end result is a butchered remaster. A bit ahead of the curve as we see so many butchered remasters these days. This edition is where the infamous Comic Sans Silent Hill Ranch sign comes from. There are a couple of workarounds if you want to play Silent Hill 2 on PC. You could use a PS2 or Xbox emulator, or you could play the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition for a PC, a fan project that allows you to play Silent Hill 2 on modern systems. It offers a high level of customization. To me, it's the best way of playing the original Silent Hill 2. Grab a copy of the PC version off My Abandonware or the Internet Archive, and install the Enhanced Edition on top of it. But here's the thing about these workarounds. For many, that's asking too much of them. Some mention that if it's not on Steam, I can't be bothered. As much as I hate this, it's the reality. I've been using emulators or fan patches on various games for years. I know many others are in the same boat. We have experiences with tweaking and fiddling around with files, something that's second nature to us. But there is a large audience out there who aren't familiar with that. Or if they can't find it on Steam, it might as well not exist. They don't want to fiddle around with files or don't have the knowledge to do so. A few years ago, there was an article that gained traction about the younger generation not understanding file folders and directories, something university professors started to notice in the mid-2010s. Kids had more experience with smartphones and platforms than computers and folders. So for those out there who can't be bothered, here's my plea to you. There's tons of videos on YouTube on how to set up Enhanced Edition or how to get emulators up and running. I've seen emulator setup videos that walk you through how to install 7-zip for heaven's sake. They'll walk you through all the possible settings with their recommendations. You can get these up and running by the time the Silent Hill 2 remake finishes downloading. Don't be like Pyrocynical. You're better than that.
The worst thing is I've never played Silent Hill 2. I've only played the first one. But I know like how the entire game works because I just sweated like Let's Plays of it. I swear it's so hard to get Silent Hill 2 to run properly on PC, like as an emulator. Like to get the director's cut. Actually, it probably isn't that hard, it's more I just can't be asked.
Now, in an ideal world, Konami would come to some kind of agreement with the team behind the Enhanced Edition and get the game up on Steam. Give them a cut of sales or compensate them for the work they put in. Some kind of recognition. Or get the game up on GOG with the Enhanced Edition ready to go. What I like about GOG is that they'll include fan patches for games. For example, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines on GOG includes the unofficial patch. Patch that makes the game playable for modern systems, fixes bugs, and restores content. If you get the game on Steam, you have to go through the process of installing the unofficial patch yourself. And as much as I love GOG, it's still a fraction of the size of Steam. It's another case where if it's not on Steam, people aren't going to bother. Which is too bad. If there was ever a time to have the original Silent Hill 2 on modern storefronts, this was the time. The same goes for Sony. The remake is a PS5 exclusive for at least a year. You'd think they have the original Silent Hill 2 or the Team Silent era titles available in their PS Plus classic game catalog, but no. From what I understand, the internal PS5 emulator for past consoles is far inferior to fan-made emulators like PSX2 or DuckStation. As always, leave it to the fans to the job when it comes to game preservation. Now let's address the third point. Tank controls, fixed camera, something that looks fun to watch, not to play. Like the accessibility element, if you weren't raised on this type of gameplay, it can be seen as antiquated. That tank controls are clunky as all hell, and you'd rather have control of the camera. Well, you do have a few options. You can change the control scheme to behave more like a traditional 3D title. The 2014 remaster of the Resident Evil 1 remake did something similar. That said, they built the game around tank controls and the fixed cameras. But if that's a sticking point, you can switch to something more like a traditional 3D title. But there are a lot of nuances to tank controls. The RE1 remake is one of the best examples of it. You could trivialize much of the game, such as evading zombies, if you play with modern controls, but it becomes a far more involved process with tank controls. Give them a shot. Try it for an hour and see if the tank controls click. You may surprise yourself. And with that, you open up a floodgate of old classic survival horror titles to check out. Or what about the fixed camera? What if that doesn't vibe with you? Well, if you do want something more modern, there was a Silent Hill 2 camera mod released in August of 2024. You could switch 2, 3, or 4 to over the shoulder or first-person perspective. It's not perfect by any means, but if you'd rather play them that way, you can. That said, the games are not built around them. They built them around the fixed camera. So these are baby steps if need be, but I encourage you to stick with the tank controls and the fixed camera. Give yourself some time to get used to them. It always warms my heart to receive comments from the younger generation who give these games a shot and end up loving them. Now, I'm not expecting everyone to do so, but please, give it some consideration. Now, why am I so insistent on this? Isn't watching a playthrough or a stream of the original enough, or videos breaking down the game itself or its themes? To an extent, but you're not getting the full experience. This leads to the question, can you be a fan of a game you haven't played? YouTube channel Shredded Nerd has a great video on the subject. He was a recent guest on my podcast and we talked about the subject. From his perspective, you're not a fan of a game. You're a fan of playthroughs or let's players, streamers or esports. How do I feel about it? Do I think you could be a fan of a game you haven't played? It's going to depend on the game. Some more than others. If you have a gameplay heavy game, you're going to lose out on more of the experience without you in control. What about something like Silent Hill 2? Not what I call a gameplay heavy game. It's more about the story and the atmosphere. You'll get more of watching the game compared to something more gameplay heavy. But at the end of the day, for the full experience, you'll need to be the one in control. To get the full experience, you'll need to move at your own pace, take in the game at your own pace, get the full context of scenes in the game itself. I've brought up the media in one of Bloober's games a few times throughout this video. I played it earlier this year to get a better understanding of what to expect from their work. It's a walking simulator with basic puzzles. I was aware of the game's issues beforehand, like the story. Yes, I could have only watched videos on the game or playthroughs. It's not very involved on the gameplay front, but I still experienced the game at my own pace to get an understanding of the game itself. It gave me a better idea of what to expect from the studio helming development of the Silent Hill 2 remake. So this is my plea to those who haven't played the original. Get the full experience by playing through it with a controller in your hands. Gather thy courage if it's faulty, and take frequent breaks if need be. Use an emulator or the enhanced PC edition. Any computer more powerful than a toaster can run it. As much as I like to see the game show up on storefronts for convenience sake, digital or otherwise, seems like that's never going to happen. There's many guides out there, text or video, to guide you through setup. Ones I'd feel comfortable with showing my grandma if she wanted to play Silent Hill 2 for whatever reason. Don't be like pyrocynical. You're better than that. Give some time to get used to the tank controls and the fixed camera. Or if that's too much, you can ease yourself in with more traditional 3D controls. Get the full experience of playing the original yourself if you haven't. You get some of the experience through playthroughs or videos dissecting the game, but not the full experience. And with that full experience in hand, you'll see yourself how the remake failed to do the original justice. So let's start to wrap this up before the video becomes more bloated than the remake's runtime. You might think I've been nitpicky, that I've been overcritical. You might think I'm blinded by nostalgia, that I should let people enjoy things and be happy that Silent Hill is back. If you like the remake, that's fine. I'm not the target audience for remakes. I've enjoyed the remakes that have come out over the last several years. There are elements of the Silent Hill 2 remake that I enjoy. While I find remakes to be unnecessary, I understand there's a large audience for them. Look at the success of the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's the best-selling game in the franchise and a very high-selling franchise. Despite my feelings on the necessity of remakes, if they are going to keep doing them, they need to do the original justice. In some areas, Bloober surprised me with their output. They put the work in for the level design and the expansion on puzzles, but then they pad the game to about double the length of the original and kill any semblance of pacing. And on the story front, I'll ask this of you. You may be on high with the hype of the release, especially after what we got with Silent Hill Ascension and the short message. But in the coming days, the coming weeks, months, when you think back to the key moments of the game's story, which version will you think of? What version will you think of with Maria behind bars in the labyrinth? The scene where James first runs into Pyramid Head in one of the apartments. The scene where James comes to terms with what he's done in room 312. Angela sending the staircase on fire. Mary's letter. What version did a better job of evoking emotions and shaking your heart? I'll leave that answer up to you, but it should be obvious that my answer are the original scenes. Doing justice to the original story was going to be a monumental task, no matter who was in charge. Part of me wonders what a remake of Silent Hill 2 would have looked like if they took the approach they're using for the Metal Gear 3 Solid remake, using the original dialogue but update it to play like a more modern title. Or if they kept development of the remake in the hands of a Japanese studio. Before Konami brought in Hexadrive to help with them on the short message, Hexadrive made a pitch for the Silent Hill 2 port. This changed into a full-fledged remake, although Konami turned down their pitch. There's a bit of a je ne sais quoi factor in how the Japanese develop video games. I would have had more confidence had they kept the game's primary development with Japan. But that's not what they did. Instead, they shipped it out west, like they did with the series back in the late 2000s to the early 2010s. Lower costs for having the game's development in Poland as opposed to Japan. And what's their return on investment like? As of writing, there's no hard numbers yet. The all-time peak concurrent player count on Steam is a little under 24,000. This falls well short of the Resident Evil remakes and the Dead Space remake. There's no given numbers yet for the PS5 sales numbers. The game is a PS5 exclusive for about a year, so there's not exactly a lot of competition on that front. One game, I don't know why. It remains to be seen if the game is a success sales-wise. And to note, despite its reputation, Silent Hill is very much a niche franchise, both to horror and to Konami. Overall series sales numbers are around 9 million by the end of December 2018. Compare that to Metal Gear, another Konami franchise which has sold around 61 million units. Several Resident Evil titles on their own have outsold the Silent Hill series. To note, Resident Evil has always had a more mainstream appeal, with much more care given by Capcom compared to how Konami has treated Silent Hill. Excluding the remake, Resident Evil 4 has as many additions as Skyrim, so it's hard to get a gauge at the moment if this will be it for Silent Hill remakes. There have been rumors that Silent Hill 3 would be next in line, which from a development standpoint would make sense. You have assets and locales that both 2 and 3 share ready to go. Sure, the story is a continuation from the first Silent Hill, but they can make changes to make it more of a standalone title. But we'll have to wait and see how that turns out, if at all. And if it never comes to light, that's fine with me. I want to be clear, I didn't want the Silent Hill 2 remake to fall short or to fail. Well, at least at this point in time. There may have been a time earlier where I was hoping for it. I am tired of remakes, but I've come to the understanding that, well, they have a sizable audience. So if they are going to keep pumping them out, at least have them do justice to the original. As well, making the original version more accessible would go a very long way. Something that Konami has been an utter failure at with this title. At the end of the day, the remake in my mind fails to do the original justice. What's made the original so beloved, discussed, and dissected? Sure, the beats are more or less the same. Most of the words are the same, but again it comes across like copying someone's homework without understanding the whys behind the answer. There is some quality work here. Again, the level design well surpassed my expectations, but the end result is a long-winded, surface-level reimagining of a psychological horror classic, one that's bloated and shallow, one that fails to capture the core foundations of what made the original such a compelling game. So as the days, the weeks, and the months go by, as the hype passes, ask yourself, did the game shake your heart deeply, especially when compared to the original? I'll leave that up to you. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel further, do consider joining on Patreon or as a YouTube member. Special shout out to those in my top 2 tiers. In the Thank You for Your Patronage tier, American Boot and Tom Terrible. Under the Now This is Boulder Punching tier, Aleatork Satan, CH3, CH2O, Ethan, The Madman, and Waco. If you'd like to receive access earlier, be featured in the credits, and more goodies, consider joining.
Psychological horror has to shake humans' heart, deeply. Shaking people's heart deeply means uncover people's core emotion and their core motivation for life. Everybody is thinking and concerning about sex and death every day. And if we want to scare or shake or touch the users or spectators, then we have to think about sex and death deeply.